Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I am Dr. Anna Wasesha, and joining me today is Professor Tad Lincoln. Tad is an associate professor of economics and political science here at Middlesex Community College. Today we're going to be talking about economy, and I thought it would be great if we could start the conversation out, Tad, if you just explain what is economics and what's the difference between economics and business administration.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today, President Wasesha. I'm very happy to be here. The short answer, and it's very hard to put together a short answer because economics covers a lot of ground. Economics is fundamentally about decision making. It's about trade-offs in society. And it also involves a branch of it involves finance and money and interest rates and things of that sort. So it's really fundamental to business decision making. Although it's not directly, say, marketing or management, it does help students to really learn the tools to make business decisions.
Could you help the audience today understand what a student in economics would learn here at Middlesex Community College?
A student would learn things such as how to make good decisions. And a good portion of our discussion, particularly in microeconomics, deals with various kinds of businesses and how they do as well as they can with their business, depending on how much competition they face, how much money they can get for their products, factoring in how much demand there is for their product and what their costs are. They can make decisions to maximize their profits. And economists, at least in the most basic analysis, always assume that businesses are trying to maximize their profits and do as well as they can.
I think you told me earlier that you're going to be offering a course in comparative economics. Could you talk a little bit about what will be the subject matter in that course?
Yes, the course is it's called International Economics, and it gets into it does get into different economic systems around the world. It gets into the interaction of various economic systems. In particular, we spend a lot of time on the interactions between the U.S. and China. There are issues with trade balance, imports and exports. There are issues with currency valuation, and they are intertwined with political issues and issues with the World Trade Organization. And there is so much to talk about in international economics, and I'm this course will be offered this spring, 2012. When it runs, it will be the first time an international economics course will run at a community college in Connecticut, so I'm very excited about it, and I'll be teaching that.
We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Middlesex Moments radio show. With me today is Tad Lincoln, Associate Professor of Economics and Political Science here at Middlesex Community College. And we've been talking about economics, what is it, and about a new course he's going to be offering this next spring on international and comparative economics. Tad, you lived in Asia, right? You were talking about the impact of the Chinese economy on the American economy. That'll be a lot of what's covered in your new course. What was it like to live on the opposite side of the world and to watch the American economy from such a distance?
It was one of the funnest times of my life. I actually spent more than 6 years living in East Asia in both Japan and China. Thoroughly enjoyed my time there. And so there definitely are different perceptions of the American system. I would say the Chinese in particular have a sort of love-hate relationship with America. They love American culture, and certainly they love a lot of the aspects of American capitalism that they've been able to adopt. But some of the older generation in particular that has been brought up on let's say, communist propaganda have a little different perception and have been very well versed on the downside of the American capitalist system and how the poor sometimes get left behind, and the big gap between the wealthy and the poor. So they are very knowledgeable, in some ways more knowledgeable than I am. I learned a lot about America while I was there. I certainly learned a lot about their economic system, and I'm hoping to integrate some of that and also what I know about the American system into this international economics class that I offer this spring 2012 at Middlesex Community College.
So many Chinese take English as part of their academic program. I mean, I think I've heard that eventually there will be more speakers of English who are Chinese living in China than there are speakers of English living in the United States. You must have met many other Americans who are doing business in China. Do you think that there are the prospect of a career in international economics and business for our students is a rosy picture, that more and more Americans will have the opportunity to work in China? And do you think that's a good thing?
I definitely think it is a good thing. The experiences that any American might have living there would be very rewarding. I think the amount of interaction between America and China and the number of people from one country working in the other will only grow over time. China's economy is expected to be the largest in the world in less than a decade now. So as the economic interaction grows, there will be all sorts of relationships. More Chinese companies in America, more American companies in China. That interaction can only grow.
Do you think that the trade, and I don't know very much about this, but I'm sure that there are trade restrictions back and forth between China and the United States? And to what degree are those trade restrictions either hampering or promoting trade between China and the U.S.? And then I think then we can jump from that into the politics, right? Because those regulations would be driven by political actors, I would think.
Right. Well, China's been in the WTO for several years. So there are sets of rules. No country follows all of the rules, but generally the U.S. tends to follow the rules more strictly than most other countries. The kinds of barriers that hinder trade these days tend not to be countries violating tariffs or quota rules. Countries tend to follow them these days. They tend to have rules that are more hidden, regulatory rules that slow trade down but are hard to quantify and are not very visible. So there are things that make it more difficult for Americans to get into the Chinese market, particularly when it is in, say, technological areas that the Chinese government wants their own firms to be successful in. So there are challenges in various ways, and the Chinese are doing everything they can to grow and to obtain whatever technologies they can to make them as successful, both economically and politically, in the coming years.
So how would you summarize, for the listeners, the strategy that the American government, the U.S. government, is following to make our relationship with China a more robust exchange? I mean, obviously they've bought a lot of our debt, and as you said, their economy is going to be the largest in the world within the decade. So what do you see happening in Washington that is, working to promote a better relationship with China, to get way, way beyond where we were, say, 30 or 40 years ago?
Oh, well, it's definitely extremely different than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Right.
Right now. The question is, where is it going to go in the next 10 years as China becomes even more economically successful and approaches an economy the size of the U.S. The economic issues will all be rooted in political issues. So I think the real short to medium term question is the whole exchange rate issue, which is related to the Chinese buying debt issue. The basic idea is the Chinese buy lots of American debt, and by doing that, they buy lots of U.S. dollars and they sell lots of Chinese yuan. And that makes, because they buy lots of dollars, that inflates the value of the dollar. And because to buy the dollars, they sell yuan, that reduces the value of the yuan. And it therefore makes Chinese exports extremely cheap in America, so cheap that American companies can cut costs to the bone and they still can't even get close to the Chinese cost. So the value of the Chinese currency has been increasing very slowly recently. It kind of stopped doing that for a year and a half or so after the crisis, but the Chinese authorities have been reluctant to allow it to appreciate in value very much, and so it gives the Chinese a huge trade advantage on every single item that they export to us. And the flip side is that our exports to China are as expensive as theirs are cheap. And so that makes for an unbalanced trade relationship. Hopefully our political system will allow us to address this sometime soon, but people have hoped for that for several years, and most economists would say that the Chinese currency is undervalued, anywhere from 15 to 40% undervalued. So that makes a big difference in the value of the price of the goods, the price of Chinese goods in America.
Yeah, sure does. Gary Locke is our new ambassador to China. He's the first American of Chinese descent to represent us there. Are these kinds of things dealt with at a diplomatic level? The trade issues and the restrictions?
Absolutely. These kinds of discussions are, well, particularly with China and the sort of government that they have, they tend to be very sensitive to the American government or any government putting pressure on them to change. And so as people say, if you put pressure on the Chinese, they're less likely to do what you want them to do because they don't want to be seen by the Chinese public as doing what other people are insisting that they do. So, but then if you don't put any pressure on them, they don't change either. So it's a real challenge for the American government to decide how to deal with this sort of issue.
It sounds like your course is going to be fascinating.
I hope so. Well, I shouldn't say that. I know so. I know the course will be very interesting, and I hope many people will be able to take advantage of how fascinating it will be.
Another thing I thought we might talk about today is the legislative internship program. So we're kind of jumping from Beijing and Washington, D.C. to Hartford, Connecticut. But can you tell us something about the opportunities to intern at the legislature and your relationship to that program, how you oversee it?
Absolutely. I'm the campus advisor at Middlesex Community College for the legislative internship program. Last year, there was no other community college in Connecticut that had more legislative interns than Middlesex Community College. So I'm very excited about the growth in our program. I've quadrupled the size of it since I've come here, and I hope to continue to grow it. And so I've been marketing the program heavily, and I've already got a couple students interested at this early date. The application deadline's October 21st. But these students, they work at the Capitol in the spring semester when the Connecticut legislature is in session, and they work there 2 days a week for a legislator. They work sometimes with the legislator, sometimes with the aide, and there are many different things they may be involved with. For example, dealing with constituent issues, working on various projects so that the legislator will be able to knowledgeably about certain issues that are being debated in the legislature, sometimes cost-benefit analysis, or sometimes just working the phones and answering questions of constituents for their legislator and numerous other things. But the short version is that they work for the legislator and do whatever it takes to help that legislator be successful, and it's the sort of experience that you absolutely cannot get in a classroom. And so we are very excited to be able to market this program heavily and happy to talk with anyone who may be interested in this program.
I think that's wonderful. It's so important for our students to, first of all, to exercise their right to vote every time that an election comes around. And the students I've known who've been interns in legislatures are just much more aware of the political process and are more willing to read the position statements of candidates and I think be informed voters, which is what we would all desire. So
Absolutely.
I'm very happy to hear that this is such a robust program here at Middlesex. I think that there are so many things to talk about. It's hard to imagine where to go next, but I'm going to take a leap and ask you about if you can kind of narrate for us the evolution of our American economy from what was an industrial manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy, and where the kind of green jobs economy might fit into that. If you could just offer your perspective, I think that would be great to hear about. And so we're going to handle some responses to those questions, and I know they're complex, but we're all interested in hearing Tad's thoughts about them, so we'll get back to that right after these. Welcome back. I wanted to let you know one of the reasons we're talking to Tad is because he's going to be hosting an hour in our student union on September 14th from 12:30 to 1:10 p.m. The public is more than welcome to come to this event, and it's under the title, Now What's Going On with Our Economy? Talk, questions, and answers. So that's Founders Hall, September 14th, 12:30 to 1:10 p.m. Well, we've been talking about the economy now for a while, and I thought maybe the way that we would cover our last segment in the radio program would be to ask Tad if he could kind of narrate the evolution of the American economy. Now, I'm nodding here in front of the microphone thinking, well, that's an enormous subject to cover in a few minutes. But if he could help us understand how the economy has morphed from one that was an industrial economy. We were the manufacturers. We were the ones who created the products and services that were wanted all around the world. And now things have changed all around us, and we talk about being a knowledge economy and an innovation economy, or perhaps even a green economy. But some of those things, like a green economy and the jobs that were promised to be developed there, seem elusive now, or at least to some of our younger generation trying to enter a new economy and find those jobs that will be there reliably for the long term. And it's just not as certain as it used to be. So we're in this climate of uncertainty and volatility. And now I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to the professor to help us understand what's going on with our economy.
Well, thank you. And I'll say first, our economy started out being mostly agricultural, more than 90% agriculture in the early days. And of course, got in on the Industrial Revolution fairly early. Of course, England did first, and we became the manufacturer, the preeminent country in the world for manufacturing, by far the largest economy in the world. But now China is the manufacturing center of the world, you might say. We remain the innovation capital of the world, you might say. And certainly because we've lost a lot of the manufacturing, and a lot of that is in China now, we've replaced that with services, which on average tend to be lower paying. And what happened there was, starting in the 60s especially, we are still the innovators, but a lot of our innovation has not been commercialized. It has been commercialized in East Asia, and the Japanese did a very good job of that through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and not as much after that. And China kind of picked up in the 80s and has continued with a policy very similar to the Japanese of obtaining in any way they can these new innovations, these new technologies, while at the same time getting some not such high-tech manufacturing in their economy as well to grow and provide jobs for themselves. But they've been very aggressive through various kinds of government policies to obtain the kinds of technologies that Americans come up with. And I think most fundamentally, that is the reason why our economy is so weak right now. We can talk about debt, we can talk about the housing market, we can talk about government deficits. But if you get at the fundamentals of why isn't the government getting that, say, the income, say, through taxes? Well, if people aren't making as much money, they're not paying as much taxes. If people have lower paying jobs, they're not paying as much taxes. So if they had higher paying on average manufacturing jobs, they'd be making more money, they'd be wealthier, they'd be paying more in taxes. So we've lost a lot of our manufacturing because a lot of our ideas are being commercialized in East Asia. And so it is my view that our government has to very carefully put in place policies that, I would say, economic defensive policies, and this is not an easy thing, because whenever the government gets involved in something, it's easy for it to be corrupted, it's easy for it to get hijacked by business interests. And that's why I say a defensive policy, because if you have an offensive policy that is picking winners, it's almost certain to be hijacked by the entrenched business interests in Washington. So if it's a defensive policy, it's defending against the taking of new ideas and new technologies that do not have entrenched business lobbying entities in Washington yet. And so if we can have knowledgeable people who are looking after some of the sorts of things like we lost to the Japanese, like the basic things like flat screens, things that were invented here that we never really made here, and make sure that these things don't go overseas. Or if the Singaporeans, it's not the Chinese, but if the Singaporeans are going to offer a company that would otherwise start up a company in Silicon Valley $2 billion to put their plant in Singapore, even though all of the suppliers are in California, but they'll go to Singapore because they can get $2 billion worth of zero interest loans and free land and you name it, they're going to go to Singapore. And so we need to, through our various espionage and other techniques of gaining knowledge, we need to refocus our efforts, as we did in the early Clinton administration, on making sure that our economy is sound and not just our military and our political aspirations are directly taken care of. I do believe that the government has to refocus their efforts. And in the Bush administration, in the Bush Jr. administration, efforts were, all the Clinton administration stuff was refocused on terrorism. And I think we need to focus them back on making sure that our economy is strong in the future.
I want to make a transition from that to go back to the Bill Clinton administration and actually the period of time when he was campaigning, and his campaign manager James Carville created the famous quip, "It's the economy's stupid." I'm guessing it's still the economy's stupid, even as we go into the silly season of the presidential campaigns that are now getting launched. At least the field of candidates is getting reviewed by the public. So what do you think are going to be the preeminent, I like your word, the preeminent issues in the economy that these candidates are probably going to be debating when they're finally called up to the stage and we get to see them in action? What will they be saying about the economy?
That it's not doing very well, and the Republicans will be saying they can do better, and Obama will be saying that it would have been far worse if he didn't do what he did. That's the basic argument that's going to be made. I can guarantee that. Well,
one of the things that I think I'm hearing is that there's certainly going to be an emphasis on deregulation. And you were just talking, this is a very complex web, right, including our creating these ideas and these innovations like flat screen TVs and having them exported very rapidly to Asia where they can be produced for much less money. What do you think that they mean with deregulation? What are they trying to achieve?
The basic idea is that when the government gets involved with regulating the economy, they sometimes, or I might even say often, make things worse than they were by getting involved. They create a bureaucracy, an expensive bureaucracy to deal with it, and sometimes this bureaucracy ends up in bed with the very entity that they're supposed to regulate. Sometimes, although we might think things are not great and we need to regulate to make them better, sometimes we might decide to leave well enough alone, let business do something that may not be perfect, but we're just going to make it worse if we get the government involved in it. But there are various kinds of regulation, and the government has been getting smarter over the last couple decades, and certainly economists are getting a lot smarter. There's various kinds of regulation that work with the market instead of forcing the market to do something that it wouldn't do. Certain kinds of incentives can be put in place to tweak business in a direction. So, for example, you can tell companies that they can only pollute a certain amount. And so, of course, if they can only pollute a certain amount, they're going to pollute up to that amount, and then they're going to play whatever games they can not to go over that amount. But it's more effective to tax them on every, say, ton of pollutant they put into the environment. And if they pay a set tax on that, then they have constant pressure on them to reduce it, because every ton that they reduce, they can save money. And that's a much more effective and a simple example of how regulation can work with the economy and with markets instead of trying to force markets to and businesses to do things that they don't want to do.
Well, you've opened another Pandora's box. So what do you think about cap and trade? Because what you're talking about sounds a lot like cap and trade.
Well, that's a good example. And we would be much better off with a carbon tax than we would be with cap and trade. A cap and trade system where you sell all of the permits to business is very similar to a cap and trade system, but unfortunately governments never sell all of the permits, or at least they haven't. They give them away, or they give away a lot of them, and then it doesn't really work like a carbon tax. So I think although cap and trade is better than nothing as long as it's implemented fairly well, a carbon tax would put constant pressure on the burning of anything that contains carbon. We would gradually roll it back as businesses try to save the money that they have to pay as a tax on carbon.
All right. Well, we've just spent the last half hour or so talking with Professor Ted Lincoln from the Economics and Political Science program here at Middlesex Community College. I think I'm kind of concluding for myself. I'm thinking that economics is core understanding that all of us really need to have in order to be workers and citizens and to be able to have a good conversation over dinner at the end of a long day. I mean, economics affects us all every day, day in and day out. Getting into this conversation with Professor Lincoln today, I was thinking how great it would be to be able to take a course in economics. Thanks a lot, Ted. I'd like to ask the listeners if they'd like to learn more about Middlesex to go to our website at mxcc.comnet, that's COMMNET, that's 2 M's in there, .edu. I'm Anna Wasesha, the new president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.